Good evening, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you to this actually third event of questions in quarantine. I don't know if you came with somebody else or if you're watching with roommates or family or someone else. You're all most welcome to this talk. I think there are already over 50 people watching on both YouTube and Zoom, so that's nice. And we hope we can make it a great evening tonight. My name is Steven. I'm your moderator of tonight, and I'm from Delft, Netherlands. So this is already the third talk or the third event of questions in quarantine. But what are these events about? These events challenges students to think about the bigger questions about life and faith. And during these events, speakers try to give an answer to these questions. But we really want to interact with you as an audience. So therefore, we have set up a Slido. You have already seen it before I started. But if you go to slide.do, and then you can put in a code, and the code is hashtag QIQ. Then you can ask questions, and you can also upvote questions for our speaker. And we can also ask questions to you, so we can set up a poll. So let's try that already if that works, because we already had some small technical issues. But let's see if Slido works immediately. And therefore, we have a poll, and I see it's already working. So yeah, I really don't know. I think nobody knows where all the people are who are watching. So we want to know, in which city are you listening this and watching this stream or Zoom session? You can put in the city, every city you want, and then it will make a word cloud. So I already see a lot of different cities. I see Maastricht, I see Rotterdam, I see Waddinxveen, Utrecht a lot, and also a lot of Delft. But that makes sense. So let's continue to our speaker of tonight. And our speaker of tonight is Michael Olds. Michael is a Christian speaker and writer based in England, and he works primarily with university students around Europe. Through his talks and books, he seeks to respond to some of these big questions about life and faith, and therefore he's an excellent speaker to answer the questions we are going to handle today. And the questions we are going to handle today is faith more than just wishful thinking? We also want to know what you think about it. So therefore, we've set up another question. I think it will also pop up in the Slido. I'm not responsible for the Slido. I see it already. So the question is, why do you think people believe what they do? And there are multiple answers: parents, friends, media, personal desires, investigation into evidence, or other. So I see already there are quite some responses, but I will first continue with my introduction. So Michael is going to talk for about 30 minutes, just like yesterday. If you have missed the talk of yesterday, it's on YouTube. If you go to Passion Week NL, then you can also find the talk of yesterday, which was about how does Corona change the things we think about life. And now Michael will talk about, is faith more than just wishful thinking? So he will talk for approximately 30 minutes, and hereafter we will dive into the questions asked in Slido. And these questions are asked by you. So on the left on your screen, there's a Q&A. There you can put in the questions, and you can also upvote questions you have for Michael. And these questions will asked to Michael by me. And therefore, I think I've almost said enough. Except for one thing. And we will say it a couple of times, and that's a feedback form, because it's all quite new and there's definitely more room for improvements. There's a feedback form. It will be shared a couple of days tonight. So please tell us what you think about the talk, if you think we can do things better or whatever. And also if you are interested to speak to us more about any of the topics that's addressed tonight or yesterday, you can fill it in. And also you can get a copy of the Uncover book. I think Michael can introduce that after his talk. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Stephen, and great to have you joining with us, whether you're in Delft, I think that was the biggest response, unsurprisingly, or Maastricht, or Utrecht, or Germany, or wherever you are. It's great to have you joining with us tonight. I'm joining you from the UK. I live just outside London in a small town called Marlow. That was my response, if you saw that on the Slido app, and it's great to be with you. I'm sorry not to be in the Netherlands. I've been many times to different universities in the Netherlands, and it's been a real joy to be able to visit some of your universities, and hopefully that will be possible later in the year as well. We might be hearing more about that later. But it's great to have you with us as we look at this big question tonight. And as Stephen's explained very helpfully to us, we're going to have a chance for your questions at the end. So on that Slido app, please do be writing your questions as we go through, voting on questions that you think are good, and we'll deal with the most popular ones at the end. And please don't feel at all inhibited to ask questions. We won't be offended if you disagree. And the nature of a talk like this, even in half an hour, we can't cover all of the issues surrounding a topic. So if there's areas that I haven't covered, please do feel free to bring that up. We'd love to try and cover as many areas as possible. But we're asking the question tonight, is faith more than just wishful thinking? I don't know whether you've ever seen the film, The Invention of Lying. It's a fascinating comedy that came out a few years ago, and it's directed by a guy called Ricky Gervais. If you've come across Ricky Gervais, you may know that he's quite an outspoken atheist. Certainly, if you follow him on Twitter, you would notice that. And Ricky is not only the director, but the lead actor in this film. And certainly his views come across very clearly in the film. The film sets up a hypothetical situation where no one in the world is able to lie. Everybody has to tell the truth. And of course, in a world where everyone has to tell the truth, everyone believes exactly what other people tell them. That is all except one person, Mark himself. He has the unique ability of everyone in the world to be able to do what they can't, that is, to lie. And he discovers that having the unique ability to lie can have all sorts of comic results. He can go up to a beautiful woman, for instance, and say to her, "I am a good-looking man," and for some reason, she's also blind because she believes him. He can also go into a bank and say to the bank manager, "I have lots of money." And clearly, without looking at the details on his computer, the bank manager gives him the money that, of course, he doesn't actually have. It's all quite fun, apart from one particular scene in the film, which is much, much more serious. Mark's own mother is sick and dying in hospital, and he goes to sit by her bedside as she contemplates her imminent death. And she's frightened. She's frightened of death, and she's frightened of the fact that beyond death, in her words, an eternity of nothingness. She's fearful of the fact that this is it. There is nothing more. And Mark tries to think about how he can comfort his mother in this moment. And he pauses and thinks, and then he looks at his mother and he says this, "Yes, mother, what you need to realize," he says, "is that when you die, it's not an eternity of nothingness. When you die, you will go to a wonderful place and all your friends will be there. And there'll be no more sadness and no more pain. And you'll be young again and you'll be able to run and dance." And with a smile on her face, his mother breathes her last and she dies. And it's a beautiful and meaningful moment, apart from when you realize what is actually being said in the context of the film. See, the point that Ricky Gervais, the director, is making through this is that this kind of belief in this place beyond death, this hope of heaven or paradise, it's just an illusion. It's a lie. It doesn't really exist. And the only reason why people believe in such things is that they want it to exist because it's attractive and comforting and nice. Now, Ricky Gervais was not the first person to suggest this idea as a reason why people might have faith or believe in God. The German philosopher Feuerbach once said a similar thing: the idea that we project our human longings into the heavens and we create a God who will meet our deepest needs and solve our greatest fears. Now, you may not have heard of the philosopher Feuerbach, but you probably heard of Sigmund Freud, who popularized this idea in one of his works, suggesting that the only reason why people believe in God is that they desire such a God to exist. Now, is that the case? That God simply exists because we want him to exist? Well, in a sense, if there is no God, that's a very good explanation about why people might still believe in God. In fact, one of the best explanations, I might want to say. Just look at what's happened in the world in the last few weeks. Apparently, according to a study by the University of Copenhagen, during the month of March, with every new 80,000 cases of coronavirus globally, the number of Google searches that involved the word prayer doubled. As we look at crises that we cannot control and fears that we have all around us, people naturally turn to God. They naturally hope that there might be something more, that there might be some divine being that can help them in that situation. But is that all God is? Just a projection of our desires? Well, if you think about it, in many ways, we can see why people would want something like the Christian faith to be true. Think about what the Christian faith says about the world and about us. It says, for a start, that the world is not an accident, that it was made purposefully by a good, loving God, a world full of beauty and goodness. It also tells us that this world is broken and damaged. It's not the way it should be, but somehow God's still involved in this world. He cares about it. In fact, more than that, he stepped into human history in the person of Jesus to deal with our deepest problems and to deal with the stuff that cuts us off from God. And the Christian faith says that in spite of the way that we've lived, we can be forgiven. We can have a relationship with this God who loves us, and nothing will separate us from his love. The Bible says our lives can be filled with meaning and purpose in spite of suffering and pain, because we know that God is with us. And get this, the Bible also says that the best is yet to come. Christian faith holds out this beautiful view of a day when one day, as we thought about last night, everything will be restored and transformed and made new. It's an incredible hope of an incredible future. Now, you might say, well, it's obvious then, isn't it? People believe that stuff because it's nice. Wouldn't it be nice to think that the world had purpose rather than was just an accident? Wouldn't it be wonderful to think that actually there is hope beyond death and not just nothingness? Wouldn't it be wonderful to know that there was a God who loved us and was willing to forgive us rather than judge us for the way that we've lived? Of course, it would be nice to think that. Who wouldn't want that to be true? So is that all faith is? Wishful thinking in stuff that's nice? Well, what can we say about that? Well, there's really three responses I'd want to make to it. And the first is this: although wanting something to be true doesn't necessarily make it true, wanting something to be true doesn't necessarily make it false either. Our desires can relate to things that are actually there. For instance, in my life, up until a few months ago, I desired to be married to a wonderful woman who would love me, who was beautiful and intelligent and caring and kind. And I'm happy to report that such a woman exists, and she is now my wife. I had desires and they have found reality. Just because I wanted something didn't mean that was never going to happen. The second thing I want to say is this: often our desires do relate to things that really do exist. We want things because there are such things out there. Now, the person who explained this perhaps most clearly was the Oxford professor C.S. Lewis. Lewis put it this way. He said, "We have such a thing as thirst, and there is such a thing as water that can quench our thirst. We have such a desire as hunger, and there is such a thing as food, which can meet our hunger. We have the desire for sex, and there is such a thing as sex, which can meet that desire." And then he says this: is the almost universal desire for the spiritual, for God, the only desire for which there is no corresponding reality? Or could it be that our desires point us towards something that really is there? But there's a third thing I want to say as well in response to this argument that faith is just wishful thinking, and it's this. Whilst it may be true that people only believe in God because they want such a God to exist, it could just as equally be true that people don't believe in God because they don't want such a God to exist. In other words, faith might be wish fulfillment, but how do we know that the same could not be charged with atheism? Could atheism be a form of wish fulfillment? Well, you might not think so, but actually there have been a number of high-profile atheists over the years who've been willing to admit as much, that actually their disbelief in God isn't just driven by their investigation into the empirical evidence, but is actually also driven by their desires. Think of someone like Aldous Huxley, a famous atheist of a previous generation. He said, "Atheism was an instrument of liberation for me, sexually and politically." In other words, atheism was convenient because it allowed me to live the way I wanted. As Dostoevsky said, if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. Or Thomas Nagel, the professor of philosophy at New York University, said, it's not just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that there is no God. He says, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want a universe like that. So yes, could faith be wish fulfillment? Perhaps. But could atheism be wish fulfillment? Well, also perhaps. Perhaps people don't believe because they don't like the idea that their lives are accountable to a higher being, that there might be a day of judgment, that the things that they do really do matter in the long term. So here's the problem. This argument from wish fulfillment helpfully explains why people believe in God if there is no God. But it equally explains why people don't believe in God if there is a God. But the one thing it cannot do is actually tell us whether such a God exists, whether the Christian faith is in fact true. And the question therefore remains, how do we know whether Christian faith is true? How do we know whether it is based on reality or is not just wish fulfillment? Well, one of the problems when it comes to asking questions of objective truth in relation to religion is often it's very difficult to answer that kind of question. Because the kind of claims that religions often make are moral and philosophical, but very hard to verify empirically. They're based on private experiences or private revelations that people have with God or some divine power. And it's very hard to investigate whether those things are actually true. How, for instance, would you empirically verify whether Buddha was in fact enlightened? Very hard. How would you investigate whether Muhammad really did receive the words of Allah in the cave that we now have as the Quran? Or might there be some other explanation? Well, again, it would be very hard to investigate. For most faiths and belief systems exist on beliefs that are very hard to verify and indeed very hard to falsify. But if a claim or a belief cannot be, at least in theory, falsified, we cannot really say that we can know that it is objectively true. But one of the differences I want to say with the Christian faith is this: Christianity opens itself up for a different kind of investigation, an investigation into the central truth claims of it. You see, the early writers of the Christian faith, the people who wrote the New Testament books, were quite quick to base the whole Christian belief system on one claim, one ridiculous, as it might seem, claim. The claim that Jesus, who lived and died, also rose from the dead. One of the early Christian writers, a man called Paul, put it this way. He said, if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, then we are to be pitied more than all men. He says the whole of Christianity falls flat like a pack of cards if the resurrection is taken away. It's the foundation stone. It's the roots from which the whole tree can find its life. So Christianity is based on this claim. But this claim of the resurrection is different to other religious claims in that it invites investigation, because it wasn't a private event that happened in a private corner, but a public event that had public implications. Now, how might you start to investigate such a claim? Well, let me say, you don't have to start by assuming that all of the New Testament texts in the Bible are correct or accurate, although there are many good reasons to think that they could be. What I'd like to do just briefly before we finish is outline for you 5 things that almost every scholar, atheist, Jewish or Christian, would agree upon in relation to the events that we've been thinking about, the resurrection of Christ. 5 things that almost every scholar would say has to have happened. And then ask the question, how do we explain such phenomenon? Let's look at those 5 facts briefly. Fact number 1 is that Jesus died. We have that documented not just within the New Testament texts, but in extra biblical sources written by people who were not Christian as well. As one historian says, it's one of the most attested facts in history. Jesus' death under the governorship of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate's death by Roman crucifixion. Secondly, though, we have the facts that 3 days later, the tomb of Jesus was empty. If it hadn't been empty, Christianity could never have begun, because it was based on this belief in the empty tomb and the risen Christ. And in fact, nobody even doubted the empty tomb for 200 years. That's the first time someone contests whether the tomb indeed was empty. And even the enemies of the Christian faith allude to the empty tomb by their erroneous explanation for the resurrection, namely that the disciples came and stole the body. So that's the second thing. The tomb was empty. We have to account for that. Thirdly, we have the supposed appearances of Jesus to his disciples. Now, some people say, well, did they just make these stories up? But the problem with that is that the disciples to a man were willing to suffer, and many of them were willing to die for this belief in the resurrection of Christ. Had they invented these stories, they would have known it wasn't true. And people do not die for things that they know are not true. People may make up stories to get themselves out of trouble, but not into trouble. It's like when I was a kid, I used to say things like, you know, the dog ate it, or my sister did it, or it was on fire when I arrived. Stories to get myself out of trouble. But I never made up a story to get myself into trouble. Why would the disciples make up a story of resurrection that actually, far from giving them power and prestige and wealth, brought them persecution and exile and death? So something happens to absolutely convince these disciples that Jesus was alive. They were somehow convinced that they had met him. We need to explain that. That's the third fact. The fourth fact is that the lives of Jesus' followers were totally transformed by this belief that he was alive after his death. And it's not just people who had previously followed Jesus, maybe some form of wish fulfillment, some kind of confirmation bias. But even those who were skeptical or downright hostile to the Christian faith became convinced and transformed by this belief in the resurrection. So we have someone like James, Jesus' half-brother, a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, and then a leader in the church in Jerusalem after these events. Or someone like Saul, who became Paul, a persecutor of the Christian faith, who encounters the living Christ and then writes most of the New Testament, travels across the Roman world and sets up many churches in different cities. We've got the transformation of these people. What was it that changed them to turn the world upside down? And then fifthly, we need to account for the rapid growth of the Christian faith that was all based on this belief that Jesus was alive. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that within 20 years, the Christian faith had spread to the heart of the Roman Empire, Rome itself. In fact, there were so many Christians in Rome that Nero was able to wrongly fasten the guilt of the fire of Rome upon them. So we've got this explosion in the Christian movement, and it's all based on this claim, which would have, at least in theory, been very easy to disprove had it not been true, that Jesus was alive. So those are 5 facts of history. Jesus' death, the empty tomb of Jesus 3 days later, the supposed appearances of Jesus, the transformation of the lives of his followers, and the rapid expansion and the growth of the Christian faith in spite of persecution in the very decades that followed this claim. And the question we have to ask is this: how do we explain those 5 pieces of evidence? Now, many people have tried over the years to explain that evidence away, but the problem is the alternative explanations can end up becoming more absurd and requiring more faith than the original proposition. An illustration of this comes from just a few years ago when a friend of mine was part of a Christian student group like the one that's organising this event, but in another university here in the UK. It was around Easter time, just a similar time to what we're in now, and they were holding an event called the Great Resurrection Debate. What they did is they took out an advert in the student newspaper and they invited people to investigate the historical evidence around the claim of the resurrection, and then to come up with an explanation for those 5 pieces of evidence that I've just outlined briefly to us. They were invited to write a short piece. These would be shortlisted, and the best entrants would be invited to give a short presentation at a meeting in the university. And then a High Court judge was coming to adjudicate which of them was the best explanation and give out a £500 cash prize, not to be sniffed at. Well, the event came, the leading contenders were able to give their explanation as to how they were going to explain away the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and so on. And the High Court judge gave his prize to a gentleman who had given an explanation that basically went this way, that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, he simply passed out, he revived in the tomb, and then people thought he was alive again. But a couple of things happened on that evening and following that was very interesting. Firstly, the student who won the prize in his acceptance speech admitted that even he himself was not convinced by the argument that he had given. He was thankful for the money, but he wasn't convinced. The second thing that happened is that the High Court judge, who himself was not a committed Christian, in his closing remarks commented that none of the explanations that had been given so far that evening would have stood up in a court of law. All of them were insufficient, and all of them would have been thrown out. And the third very interesting thing that happened just a few weeks later is that the student who won the prize actually became a committed Christian himself. Why? Because he became convinced that the only explanation that really fitted the historical evidence was this, that Jesus Christ really was alive. And he figured that if Jesus was alive, then Christianity was worth believing, whatever the cost. Now, I say that because so often we can easily dismiss a claim like the resurrection before we've really looked into it. And our invitation to you would be to actually to study it for yourself, to investigate whether this could be true, because we've become convinced that there are many good reasons to see that it is true. Indeed, many people over the years have sought to investigate the resurrection, to debunk it, to get rid of it, and have had to change their mind as they've found the evidence so compelling. Question is, are we willing to look at the evidence, and are we willing to go where the evidence leads? You see, the point I want to say is this: Christianity and Christian faith is not too good to be true, but Christian faith is good because it is true. The Christian faith isn't just wish fulfillment based on our desires, but wonderfully, not only does it meet our desires and our greatest needs, it is true. There really is a God who created us. There really is a God who is interested in our broken and messed up world. There really is a God who stepped into human history and experienced all of the brokenness and pain upon himself on the cross. There really is a God who can be connected with through faith in Jesus, who can be with us through life. And there really is a God who can take us through death and promise us a world that will be transformed and made new. That's not too good to be true. It is good because it is true. And therefore it means finally that to have faith in Jesus does not require so much a leap into the dark, but a step into the light. So often we talk about faith as if we're leaping off a cliff. We're like Indiana Jones, stepping into the unknown and hoping that somehow something might save us. But that is not the kind of faith that we find in the Bible. Faith in the Bible is always commitment to something from which we're convinced is true. And so rather than leaping into the unknown with no reason for what we believe, Christians say, no, I'm going to place my commitment and life in something that is true and solid and certain. So I guess my question to you as we draw to a close for this part of the talk and as we open it up to questions in a moment is, where are you at then when it comes to this question of faith? Have you placed your faith in Jesus Christ or not? And if not, what is it that's holding you back from doing that? Maybe you still think Christian faith is a leap into the dark, into the unknown. It would be irrational. It would be going against what you know. But I guess my encouragement would be for you to continue to investigate into these things. There are so many things that we can base our Christian faith on: the evidence for God, the reliability of the Bible, the historical evidence for Jesus, the way that Christianity has transformed people's lives, the way that it makes sense of life, as we thought about last night, and in particular, as we thought about tonight, the resurrection of Christ. Look into these things and say, could this be true? Why not take one of the accounts of Jesus' life yourself and read it through? We've got some that we'd love to give. This is in English, but we've also got it in Dutch. It's called Uncover, and it's one of the biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. And it's a great way to investigate for yourself the claims that we're thinking about tonight. So why not apply for that? We'll put out on the feedback form an option to be able to get one of those. We'll physically send you a copy wherever you're locked in at the moment, so you can read that. And it would only take you 2 hours, but at the moment, some of us have got plenty of time on our hands. And even if we didn't, can I say, this would be worth looking into. It might be you're saying, well, actually, I haven't put my faith in Jesus, but I don't think it's rubbish. In fact, I'd like to know how I could do that. I'd like to think more about what's involved in that. And again, we'd love to continue a conversation with you. We'd love to be able to help you think through whatever barriers or objections still remain in your mind before you can do that. But also, we want to say, if Christian faith is a commitment upon something that we can be convinced of, if it's open to us all, then actually we don't need to put that off to some distant future. It's not simply something we do on the moment before we die, as if the Christian faith only offers hope beyond death. No, it means life before death as well as life after death. It's something we can embrace right now. So why not put your faith in Jesus? Why not turn to this God who's revealed himself in Jesus and ask him to come into your life and to give you this hope, this meaning, this purpose, this relationship and this love that we've talked about tonight. The wonderful thing is you can experience that for yourself. And you may still have doubts and questions, and you know that's totally okay, because doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubts are actually helpful things, rightly used, because they cause us to investigate and discover more of truth. But hopefully what you might be starting to discover is that our doubts and questions actually lead us towards truth, towards something that we can be convinced of. And by the way, don't wait until you're 100% convinced before you're willing to do anything about what you've now heard. The reality is in life that there are very few things that we're 100% convinced of. That doesn't mean we make irrational decisions. It just means that we go with the weight of the evidence, don't we? Yes, we could be super skeptical. Yes, we could be a conspiracy theorist that always likes to come up with an alternative explanation. But generally, we go with the weight of the evidence. We do that in all sorts of areas of life. Why not with this? Why not, rather than waiting until every question has been answered and every I has been dotted and every T has been crossed, why not actually say, given what I know, it would actually be a bigger leap to reject all of this than to actually accept it. Why not turn to God and put your trust in him? You might say, well, I'm worried about what difference that will make in my life. And it will make a difference. But if this is a God who loves us, if this is the kind of God we've been thinking about tonight in Jesus, this is a God you can trust with your life, with your future, whatever that's going to mean. It won't always be easy, but it will be worth it. And truth is worth following, even if truth is difficult. So can I encourage you not to just put this off, but even tonight maybe to turn to God and say, God, I want to put my trust in you. I want to discover this life that you offer. I want to know this hope that you can give me. And please come and do this for me now. He can and he will, but he's waiting for us to ask him to come on board. So why not do that? Well, we're going to go back, I think, to Stephen now. He's got a few things to say about how you might want to follow up on what you've heard tonight, and then we'll be going to questions. So please do be using this time to write your questions down if you've not already. I've raised lots of claims tonight that you may want to come back on. So please do, and I'm just looking down, there's a number already. Please keep them coming. Please keep voting on them as well. Back to Stephen.
Yeah, Michael, thanks for your 30-minute talk. I hope it was 100% clear for everyone, but probably not. So I've already seen a couple of questions, and we will go into them within a minute. But first, about the uncover that Michael just showed. We have them throughout the whole of the Netherlands in English and Dutch. So if you really want that uncover and discover kind of the story yourself, we have them. We can't give it to you by hand in these days, but we will send it to you. And how can you get one? I already talked about the Google Forms. It's already shared a couple of times. You can fill it in. You can give feedback over there. You can say, I want to uncover book. And you can also say, I want to talk, I want to go into a conversation with somebody. Just let us know, and then we will call or text you, and then we will go into conversation. And then maybe we can help you out. I think also we are not 100% sure, but yeah, we can find it maybe together. So let's do that. And then we can go to the first question, I believe. So the first question, if faith is trust, how are we to know which of the many interpretations of the Bible / God is the truth? Catholic, evangelical, reformed?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. If faith is trust, let me just read it again so I've got it clear. How can we know which of the many interpretations of the Bible is the truth? Yes, it's a good question, because whilst we may have one Bible, we have many different churches. Apparently, I heard that if you take all the denominations of Christian church in the world, you come up to a number at around 33,000. To put that into perspective, that means that if you went to a different church every single week, you still wouldn't have time in an average lifetime to visit every denomination going. So we seem to have all of these different interpretations and different ideas about the Bible, and it seems very confusing. Which one am I going to go for? Well, the first thing I just want to say is that whilst different denominations do have different opinions on certain aspects of the Bible and the Bible's teaching, there are also some areas of really strong agreements that go right across the different major denominations. Questions about the divinity of Christ, that in Jesus we have God revealed in humanity. Questions about God's creation of the universe. It's created for good purposes, that we can know him, and so on. So it's not that every denomination has a completely different interpretation of the Bible, but it's also worth pointing out that there are some significant differences down through the years, particularly between some of the major denominations, the Orthodox, Protestants, and Catholic streams of the church historically. How are we meant to decide which one is true? Well, one of the aims of the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago was not in many ways to create a new church, but to try and reform the church back to what the Bible was originally teaching. There was a sense that some of the teachings of the church 500 years ago had so departed from the teaching of the Bible that it was no longer actually being faithful to the foundation that they claimed to follow. And so Martin Luther and others protested against that, which is where we get the word Protestant from. So what we're looking at is actually, what does the Bible say? And what we need to do is, whatever the church is, whether it's Protestant or Reformed, whether it's Catholic or Orthodox, to compare the teaching of that church, the teaching of that Christian leader or whatever, with what the Bible says. And so what we're really encouraging people to do is to not simply blindly take the teaching of any Christian leader, not to do that for me either, but to get your nose into the Bible and to, for yourself, investigate the claims of the Bible. That's why, for instance, we really like pushing something like Uncover, because we say, look, rather than taking secondary sources, go back to the primary source. And decide for yourself. That's not to say that everything in the Bible is immediately easy to understand, but the important stuff, we want to say, is really clear and can be understood and doesn't require someone else to have to explain it to you. We don't have to rely upon a priest or a Christian leader to be able to understand it. That's why, by the way, in the Reformation, there was a strong desire to interpret the Bible into everyday languages, because there was a desire for people to be able to read the Bible for themselves. So whichever denomination we might look at, we just need to say, what does it teach, and how does that compare with what the Bible teaches, and where do they get their teachings from the Bible? But just a word of encouragement. The organization that have put this event together, in fact, the organizations that I spend a lot of my time speaking for, Christian student groups around Europe, are made up of Christians from many denominations. They may have differences of opinion about certain issues, about the length of creation, or about the age of baptism, or the mode of baptism, and so on. But they also have a great level of agreement on certain things that they would all say, hey, these things are important. These are the most important things. So don't get too worried about it either.
I think I fully agree with Michael. I think a lot of people also around me, they have different opinions, but eventually also these events, I think we all agree with what Michael has said. So also, if you are invited by someone tonight, yeah, you don't have to go to a church for some answer. Also, go to that person. Yeah, we really want to help you further in kind of the search to its faith more than just wishful thinking. So if we can help you, yeah, just also you can also fill in the form if you are here just by accident or maybe yeah, fill in the form and then maybe we can keep in contact with you and also talk about it. I think then it's time to go to the next question. I have to check what question it is. There are quite a lot of questions. So if you think one of the questions is really interesting, give it an upvote. I see there are already 2 questions that are highly upvoted. So I think let's take the first one. Are there also such strong pieces of evidence about the claims of other religions?
Yes, thanks for the question. You might be listening to this saying, well, that's a very compelling case for Christianity. We would expect you to be able to do that. You're a Christian speaking at a Christian event. But if we invited an imam, wouldn't he present an equally persuasive case for Islam and Muhammad and so forth? Well, actually, that's one of the things I'd love people to do, is to actually do a comparative study of the kind of claims that religions make. And one of the things that I was saying is that actually, when it comes to the basis of the religious claims that we look at in our world, many of them are very difficult to investigate historically. So, for instance, take the issue of the claims of Islam. If you read the Quran itself doesn't really make historical claims about places or events. It's basically a system of, this is what God is saying to you, and thus says the Lord, you might say. And so it'd be very hard to say that's true or false, because it's not rooted in real space-time history. It's a series of timeless revelations. That's what a Muslim would probably say. So how do we know if it's true? Well, we don't, do we? Now, Islam does make certain historical claims. It makes claims about Muhammad, where he lived, what he did, and so forth. And again, on those questions, we might say, well, or on what reason do we have to think that they're true? And on a like-for-like comparison, I find this quite interesting, because we know that the New Testament documents were written within the 1st century. Almost every scholar, Christian or not, would have to agree upon that. But the earliest sources we have for the historical information for Muhammad's life, his biography, I've got one of them just behind me here, is from 200 years after his death. And that's admitted by Islamic scholars. That's not skeptical atheists that are saying that. That would be an Islamic understanding of the earliest documentation for Muhammad's life. That's a 200-year gap between his life and the first written evidence for him. And there are a number of really serious questions that we might want to ask about those kind of claims. Again, another book, I didn't put them here especially because I didn't know the questions were coming up, written by a secular historian, Tom Holland, in The Shadow of the Sword, asks some very interesting questions about the growth of Islam. For instance, why is there no evidence for the existence of a city called Mecca in the 7th century? Why is it this doesn't seem to fit? Why is it that the early growth of the Arabian people across the world at that time seemed to make no mention of Muhammad until much later, and so on? And so there are lots of questions where, when we investigate the historical sources to say Islam, it doesn't seem to stand up in the same kind of way. So I would say, absolutely, don't just take what I'm saying, compare it and ask the same critical questions of any other faith and see what you come up with. And I would say that there are stronger reasons to accept the historical basis for Jesus and his life than I think there would be for any other leader comparatively. And that would be one strong reason, I think, for seriously investigating him further. But you may want to come back on that, I'll just say too. So please feel free to come back with further questions.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think I already have kind of a small question, because you talked in your talk about the spreading of the Christianity, and that's in a couple of years it was spread across whole Southern Europe. So how does that compare to the Islam?
Yes, that's a really good question. So we talked about the growth of Christianity. We said Tacitus documents its growth by talking about the presence of Christians in Rome by the time of Nero. Obviously a distance quite significant from where it began in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. What about that in comparison with the spread of Islam? Well, there is a similar comparative growth of Islam over a similar period of time. And so the growth of a worldview or belief on its own doesn't necessarily mean that that belief is true. That happens in other situations as well. I think the difference, the very significant difference though, is this. Up until the 4th century, Christianity is a persecuted minority. In other words, it's on the whole rejected and persecuted by the Roman Empire and by Jewish authorities on the whole as well. It's only with the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century that Christianity gains political power, and it's no longer dangerous to commit yourself to following Jesus Christ. Up until that point, it's highly dangerous to do it. The difference is that by the end of Muhammad's own lifetime, Islam has political power. And so actually it is politically expedient to align yourself with that new movement, and actually politically dangerous to not do that. So all I would say is the fact that Christianity grew in spite of, rather than on the back of, political power makes us ask questions about why those people were so committed to it. It doesn't prove that it's true, it doesn't prove that it's false, but it makes us have good reasons for thinking that these people were absolutely compelled that this was true and weren't just doing it for personal reasons.
Okay, thanks for this clarification. I think I've already taken too much time, so I would just throw the next question. And the next question is, would you say faith in general is the silencing of the fear for the unknown? If not, how do you explain ancient tribes around the world having some kind of faith?
Okay, how would I explain ancient tribes having some kind of faith? Is it the silencing of the fear of the unknown? There's a verse in the Bible that says God has placed eternity on our hearts. In other words, in all of our hearts, whether we are Christian or not, whether we've encountered religion or not, there is a desire for the eternal. There is a desire for something beyond ourselves. And it's a very fascinating study that there's never been a culture that's ever been discovered in history that has been completely atheistic. Clearly not all been Christian, but there have been this sense of something more beyond the physical realm. And where there have been attempts to try and make completely atheistic cultures, like for instance in Albania in the second half of last century, they ultimately failed. They weren't able to squash religious belief, although that was the projection and the hope, obviously, of people within that movement. Now, as we said earlier, there's two explanations. You might say, well, that's just wish fulfillment and everyone in the world has the same kind of wish fulfillment. But as C.S. Lewis said, is this the only universal desire for which there is no corresponding reality? Or is it an indication that there may indeed be something beyond the natural, the physical, that there might be some kind of God? And I would say, you could equally say, this points us towards the fact that actually God has made us to long for him, to reach out for him and to try and find him. But on its own, it's not a compelling argument either way. What we'd need is some kind of way for God to reveal himself to us in a more meaningful way. And that's what the Christian faith is claiming in Jesus, that he has actually done that and revealed himself to us.
Thank you, Michael. I think I want to point at least one more time to our feedback form. So if you have any feedback, probably I'm going to say it also at the end, but if you have any feedback, just let us know what you think about this, because this is the third event. So also, if you want to know more, you can fill in that form, but you can also join other events. I will announce them at the end, but you can also find them on passionweek.nl. Go there and find other events, and all the events are also recorded, and you can find them back online on YouTube or at passionweek.nl. So let's continue. The next question is: the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus is nice, but doesn't atheism offer a lot more answers, explanation, and evidence?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm not sure exactly where the question is coming from in terms of, does atheism offer a better explanation for the particular claims around the resurrection, or more generally? I guess I'll try and answer it a little bit in both ways, just in case I've misunderstood the question. one of the ways that we want to investigate truth claims or belief systems is to ask, what kind of explanation does it give of reality? And there are lots of different things that we could look to in regard to that. So for instance, we could look at the beginning of the universe, we could look at the fine-tuning of the universe, we could look at the existence of moral values, or we could look at the sense of human value that we have as human beings, often referred to as human rights, or we could look at, as we mentioned before, the universality of religion or spirituality, or we could look more exclusively at, say, the life, death and resurrection of Christ and the evidence surrounding that. And actually all of us need to say, what do we make of that? And if I'm an atheist, I need to account for those things. And if I'm a Christian, I need to account for those things. What I would say is that whilst obviously there are atheistic explanations of why the universe began, or why this universe seems to be so finely tuned for life, or why moral values might have come about where there is no moral lawgiver, or why the appearances of Jesus in the empty tomb could have been explained without the resurrection of Christ, whilst there are explanations out there, I don't find them as compelling or convincing as the Christian explanation in regard to those different things. But it is a helpful thing to actually go through those different things and weigh them up and say, actually, what do I make of this? Do I find the existence of a God a good explanation for the beginning of the universe? Or how else am I going to explain the existence of a universe from nothing, or so on? So yes, we need to look at them side by side, but the reason why we homed in on the resurrection is because Christianity itself has always opened itself up for investigation on that claim. Christians are basically saying, look, this is the ultimate way we can know whether this is true. It's not the only way, but it's the ultimate way. It's the climax of many other investigations.
Thank you, Michael. I think also, for the person who asked this question, indeed, it's kind of fake if it's about the resurrection or not. But if the explanation and evidence for other answers are better at, in atheism, then go into a conversation with people you know that are Christian. Yeah. And then you can compare them yourself, and maybe that's really helpful also to see which explanation maybe is better or maybe not.
Absolutely, and it'd be a great thing to do over a virtual coffee or something like that, or a virtual beer, is just to say, okay, let's take some of these ideas and let's see how we might account for them. And if you've got a Christian friend, get them to explain how they would. Try and work out how you would if you're not a Christian, and discuss them. And that's a really helpful way to investigate truth, and good use of time as well.
Yeah, and it's also helpful for us. Then let's also go to the next question. I think we all agree that Jesus has changed a lot of lives, with Muhammad, Hitler, and other persons in human history too. What's different in your opinion?
Okay, just looking at the question again, just to make sure I've understood it. So people have changed history. Lots of different people have in different ways. And so the fact that someone has a massive influence upon history doesn't necessarily mean that we should follow them. And I think in the case of Hitler, that's pretty obvious. There aren't many kids called Adolf these days for obvious reasons. We don't want to follow someone like him or his ideas because we can see where they lead. And I guess the question is, how do ideas pan out in reality? One of the problems so often is that ideas can seem nice in theory, but in reality, they can be quite different. One of the things I find compelling about Jesus is the way Jesus has transformed human history over 2,000 years. It's a fascinating book. It was behind me, but I've just given it to my neighbour, actually, who's reading it at the moment. Also by the same historian, Tom Holland, called Dominion. And basically, he's looking over 2,000 years of history, and he's saying Christianity has influenced, not just Christianity in general, but Jesus Christ in particular has influenced the Western world, in fact, the whole world, more than we can imagine. So if we think just for one idea, the idea of human rights, this universal sense that we think that people have real dignity and value, where does that come from? He says you cannot escape from the fact that grew out of a Christian view of the world. So I would say, look at the influence of Jesus on history, not just in terms of its magnitude to impact history, but whether it's done good or ill. Now, the often comeback to that kind of answer would be to say, okay, yes, there are some good things the Christian church has done, but there are a lot of bad things the Christian church has done as well. What about the Crusades? What about the Inquisitions? What about war and violence and so on? And therefore you have to say, well, yes, there are lots of people who have done good in the name of Christ. There are lots of people who've done bad in the name of Christ. But who was being consistent with Jesus? Who was living out what Jesus taught most consistently? And that's something you need to look into. And the only way you can really know that is by actually looking at Jesus himself and saying, okay, well, what did Jesus teach? What would it look like to live that out? Similarly, of course, you could do that with someone like Muhammad. You could say, okay, well, let's read a biography of Muhammad. Let's look at the historical case for him. What would it look like to live that out? And so I would just want to say, I don't think there's anyone in history that has not only influenced history more than Jesus, but could have had a more positive influence. He has transformed human history. But more than that, we'd also want to say he can transform our lives in a very real way today.
Thank you, Michael, for answering this question. I think it's almost time for our last question, or maybe it's time for our last question. And thereafter, there will be some final words for me. So still a couple of words from Michael about the last question. So let's go. Hi there. I'm on my way of getting close to Christianity. What do you think of believing in the existence of God, but not believe in the world is created as the Bible says?
Okay, good question. And can I just say a couple of things before this? Firstly, I'm sorry that we've not been able to deal with all the questions. I'm just looking down here and there's some great questions and I wish we had time to deal with all of them, but maybe you can chat about them with the friend that invited you to watch tonight. They'd be well worth having a Zoom date and a beer and a chance to chat about them more. And also just to say that what I've said in answer to these questions is in no ways intended to be the exhaustive, complete answer. All of these would deserve a whole evening of their own, at least. So I'm not trying to say everything, or at least hopefully you'll realize there's more that could be said. I'm getting close to believing Christianity, but what about the bit about creation, basically? What you might discover if you do become a Christian is that whilst Christians do agree on lots of things, like the fact that Jesus was God, that he came into human history, that in his death we can have forgiveness, through his resurrection we can have hope, and that he can be within their lives by his spirit day by day. There are massive areas of agreement. There are also areas where committed Christians who believe the Bible and love Jesus have different opinions. And creation, and particularly the exact mode and manner of creation, is one of those areas where Christians have discussed and debated and not always agreed in history or today. There are Christians who believe that the Bible tells us that the world is about 6,000 years old, created in 6 literal days of 1 week, and they would take a very literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. But that is certainly not the only explanation that Christians have given or do give. And that wasn't simply a response to evolution, by the way, either. Augustine, writing hundreds of years before evolution came along as a theory, suggested that the days in Genesis might be taken poetically to be symbolic of longer periods of time. And there are Christians that therefore say that the Bible might be describing a world that is much older. It doesn't tell us at all how old it really is anyway. And that the creation story is not so much giving us a literal explanation of 6 days of 1 week, but telling us about God's relationship with the world and our place within the world in relationship to God. And they might even say, well, God could have used the mechanism of evolution as we understand it on the whole to bring about his creative purposes. But the difference is, they would say, that therefore evolution is not an unguided process that came about by chance, but it is the purposeful design of God and brought about God's creation, us as we are today. So there are lots of different ideas. I've just sketched out 2 of the kind of extreme ends of that spectrum. There are different interpretations within it. And I would just say, it's okay to have different views on that, and it's worth looking into it. And as a Christian myself, I've changed my view on that several times whilst being a Christian, because the Christian faith is not built on a foundation of how we understand the first chapter of the Bible, although it teaches important things about God's relationship to us and what's gone wrong with the world. But the Christian faith is built on Jesus. Christianity is about Christ, and that's why we want to home in on who was he? Did he really live? Did he really die? Did he really rise again? What does that mean for me? And those are areas where we'd want to say, hey, Christians of all stripes have real agreement and unanimity, and for which there's real evidence. Problem with talking about creation is I wasn't there, you weren't there, and it's very hard to objectively investigate the claims made. The difference with the resurrection is that actually we can look into historical sources from real space-time history and say, hey, what do we make of all of this? So do keep looking into it. And as I said, I'm really sorry that we can't deal with all the questions there. I'd love to spend some more time going through some of them, but we're out of time.
Thank you, Michael. It would be something if you were there when at start of the year. But I think I also couldn't agree more that this is also some material for discussion also for Christians. So I think also within the Christian world we have to talk about this and have good conversations also with each other. So that's important. I see there are still a lot of questions. I think there are about 9 or 10. I haven't checked it the last 5 minutes. However, we can handle these. But if you want an answer to these questions, please fill in the form that you want to talk with someone, and then we can try to answer these questions personally with a virtual coffee or a beer or whatever you want. I think the form is again shared in the YouTube stream and also in the Zoom stream. You can also fill in there that you want an cover. We have an English and Dutch version, so we can send it to you, and then you can explore this yourself, or maybe also with someone, or you can also say, I want to explore it together with someone else who can explain to me. That's all okay, just say it, and we are going to help you. And also, if you have feedback for these talks, please leave feedback for our next talks. We will have a couple of other talks. These will all be online. Hopefully after the summer, we will also have real talks, also in Delft, hopefully with also with Michael, somewhere in October or November, I believe. But you can follow Passion Week on Instagram or Facebook and keep informed. So if you are interested, you can do that, and you can join after the summer break, hopefully some real events. Then about the upcoming events that are online. The first upcoming event is on the 30th of April, which is about hope beyond fear. And there will be Almentine Lene and Andries Nevel will talk about fear, God, and hope. And that's on the 30th of April. And then there's also another scheduled event. Hopefully it's also shared in the chats. I'm not sure, I'm not doing that. But the other event is A God Who Cares. This one is in English. The other one I talked about is in Dutch. So that's maybe good to know if you are an international student. And the event A God Who Cares is the 6th of May, also at 8 p.m. You can find all these events because there will be, hopefully will be many more. They will be on passionweek.nl, and you can find them there. You can tune in also hopefully on a YouTube stream and a Zoom link. So whatever you want, feel free to join, and hopefully you can also watch them afterwards. And then we are at the end of tonight. So we all like to thank you for joining this Questions in Quarantine. We have had a really good time, at least I had, and I hope this talk somehow inspired you and gave you new insights. I do like to thank Michael Otts. You've done a great job. And I do like to thank all the people that work behind the screens. It's quite some effort to make it technical all happen. And also today it was kind of living on the edge, but we have made it possible and it worked. So thanks to the whole team. But most of all, I would like to thank you as audience for all the questions you sent, for joining in, for the interactive session we had at the beginning. That's nice, and I hope you enjoyed also. You enjoyed it a lot. Then have a great evening, and remember, even though life after Corona is far away, and it seems like wishful thinking to believe it ends soon, there's something that could be more than just wishful thinking, and that's faith. And that is also something we could grab onto these times. I wish you all the best. Stay safe and stay healthy. Goodbye.
Bye.